Hi class. Today we're going to be talking about unemployment and inflation in Chapter 4. Unemployment and inflation are generally considered the twin evils of macroeconomics. It's easy to see why. We don't like unemployment and we don't like inflation. Both of them have negative aspects associated with them that we'll talk about today. We're also going to describe how unemployment is measured. We're going to look at the different types of unemployment and discuss the costs of unemployment. Then we're going to move on to inflation and discuss how it's defined, measured, and we're going to take a look at the causes and costs of inflation. An important definition related to unemployment is the working age population. So the working age population are essentially those legally able to work. So we look at if you're under the age of 15, you're removed from the working age population because you're not legally able to work. There are some minor differences in between provinces, but generally it's 15. The Statistics Canada, when they calculate this, they actually don't include the 3 territories or Aboriginal reserves because they want to look at these groups differently and look at the statistics separately for those groups. We also, of course, don't want to include people who aren't legally able to work because they're in a prison, or people who just can't work because they're hospitalized or they're in the armed forces. Begin by looking at how Statistics Canada goes about calculating the unemployment rate. Start with the total population of the country. So in Canada, in 2015, the total population was 35.86. Now, remove those people who aren't legally able to work, most notably children under 15. So after we remove them, we're left with the working age population. Okay, so the working age population in Canada was 29.28 in 2015. What we're interested in is finding what the labor force is, because that's what we're going to base our unemployment statistic off of. So the working age population is not the labor force. So these people are legally able to work, but not all of them are working. We want to remove those who are not willing or able to work. So we want to remove people who are, say, disabled, if they're retired, independently wealthy, full-time students. All of these people are not willing or able to work, so we don't consider them as part of the labor force. Once we remove them, then we have our labor force. So in Canada in 2015, our labor force was 19.28 million. Now the labor force consists of 2 groups, simply those who are employed and those who are unemployed. In Canada, the number of people employed in 2015 was 17.95, and those who were unemployed were 1.33 million. Now, the unemployment rate is simple. It's just the proportion of the labor force, so this whole rectangle here, that are unemployed. So we take the number of people unemployed and then divide it by the overall labor force. So Canada in 2015, employment rate Canada-wide was 6.9%. And again, we're taking the number of people unemployed and dividing by the labor force. Now, there's another important statistic that we can calculate given this information here, and that's called the participation rate. The participation rate is the proportion of the working age population, so this whole rectangle here, that are participating in the labor force. Okay, so in order to calculate that, we take the labor force and divide it by the working age population. Now, this is an important statistic because if you think about it, it's the labor force that, people who are employed in the labor force that are generating the wealth in the country. They're the ones that are creating the goods and services and are responsible for the gross domestic product, which is also equal to the nation's income. So we would like this to be as large as possible. So for Canada in 2015, when we take the labor force and divide it by the working age population, we get that the participation rate is 65.8%. It's notable to point out that in the coming years, the participation rate is expected to fall to some extent because there's a large number of baby boomers. So that's the people who were born in the 40s and 50s. They make up a very large proportion, a disproportionate size of the overall population. So many of them are entering the age in which they retire. So in that case, we're going to see that the people who are not willing or able to work, so this rectangle is expected to increase relative to the labor force. So in that case, we would expect this participation rate to fall to some extent. Now that may be offset also because Canada has a very large number of immigrants that enter Canada each year, and that's what the government is actually trying to offset this by increasing how many people can immigrate to Canada. So it may not change all that much. It's an interesting statistic because we would like this to be as large as possible because this is what generates the tax base for the country and the overall income. Okay, so that's how we calculate the unemployment rate and participation rate. So if we look over time at the participation rates in Canada, we can see that they've changed quite substantially over the decades. Here we have the participation rates in Canada from 1975 to 2015. And as you can see, the participation rate of females has increased substantially. In 1975, the number of females participating in the labor force was just over 45%. And that's increased substantially. So there's been sort of a convergence between males and females in terms of labor force participation. If we look at the unemployment rates in Canada from 1990 up to 2015, we can see that, first of all, in the early 90s, we had very high unemployment rates. So we had unemployment rates as high as 12% for males and just over, well, close to 11% for females. Now, if you look at the years afterwards, we see another jump here. This was the financial crisis, and we see that the unemployment rate jumped up substantially in this period as well. So during recessions, we will see that the unemployment rate will increase substantially. And now, of course, with this COVID-19 events, we're going to see substantial increases in the unemployment as well in 2020. So the data hasn't come out yet for that, but when it does, we're going to see very high. So let's do an active learning question. So suppose that the unemployment rate in an economy is 7.5%, and the total population is 250 million, and the size of the labor force is 180 million. Number of employed workers in this economy is, so how do we get the number of employed workers in this economy? I'll give you a moment to see if you can figure it out. Okay, some of you got the answer correct. So the correct answer is C. So what we do is we figure out the number of people who are unemployed, okay, and we can do that by taking 0.75 times the labor force. That will give us the number of people unemployed, okay, and then we know that once we have that figure, we just subtract it from the 180 million, because we know that the labor force only has the two groups, unemployed and employed. And so once we know the number of people unemployed, then we just subtract that from 180 and we get that the difference is 166.5. Another question, we're told that the labor force here is 190 million and the number of people not willing or able to work is 40 million. Participation rate then must be, give you a second and see if you can figure that one out. Remember that diagram at the beginning of the box here as being the working age population, right? And then we know that this upper box here is the labor force. So we're told the labor force is 190. And then remember here represents people who are not willing or able to work. So this is 40. So, Q, what is the working age population then? And if you like, yes, that's correct. So yeah, Healy and Joshua got it correct. So it's 230. So we know the working age population is 230. The participation rate is just the labor force divided by the working age population. So we're going to take 190 and then divide it by 230. And when we do that, we get that the answer is 82.6. Good with that? Talk about the different employment. So we can categorize people into people who are unemployed into different groups. So the first one is frictional unemployment, and this type of unemployment refers to people who are in between jobs. So if you quit your job and you're looking for a new one, or you just graduated and you're on the labor market for the first time looking for a job. So now this type of unemployment is unavoidable because there's always going to be some frictions in the labor market. There's always going to be some people in between jobs, no matter how good the overall economy is performing. Strong employment is this type of unemployment relates to people who lose their jobs because their skills are no longer marketable. So we're talking here about a mismatch in the skills or location between jobs available and the people looking for work. So sometime, at some point in the past, people who repaired typewriters, obviously they would have been structurally unemployed at some point because typewriters were no longer used, and so their skills were not useful anymore. So someone who is, reason we can unemployed. Now, cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that we typically think of when we think of unemployment. It occurs because there's some kind of a recession, so there's a decrease in economic activity, and people are out of work because of that. So at the peak of the business cycle, when the economy is doing very well, actually we were likely pretty close to a peak just before this COVID-19 incident occurred. We had the lowest unemployment rate in many decades. And so we could say then, before this happened, the cyclical unemployment rate was probably close to zero. But we can't have a zero unemployment rate because we're always going to have some frictional or structural unemployment. Some textbooks also mention seasonal unemployment. So seasonal unemployment could also be greater than zero, right? So we can't really get the unemployment rate down to zero, but the best we can do is to have cyclical unemployment equaling zero. Rate of unemployment for exactly that. It's the term that refers to when there is no cyclical unemployment. So it includes, obviously then it's going to occur when there's full employment. So when everyone is working. So in terms of a definition, we can say that the natural rate of unemployment is the lowest rate of unemployment that an economy can sustain over the long run. Full employment, and again, it's when there's no cyclical unemployment. Now, the employment can change over decades for various reasons. The natural rate of unemployment in, say, the 1940s, was a bit lower than it is now because back then they didn't have the social security system that we have now. They didn't have unemployment insurance. So when you lost your job, there was an urgency to get one very quickly. But you can think that since the advent of unemployment insurance benefits, when people do get laid off, they can spend more time searching for work. And so at any point in time, you're going to have more people unemployed. Now, also, things that can change the search time for jobs can affect this natural rate of unemployment. Likely the creation of the internet and how we can look for jobs now quickly just in our house on the internet. We have many sources, so we can actually find jobs and apply to jobs much quicker than, say, in the 1980s, where you had to actually look in the newspaper every week or go down to the unemployment office and look at postings on the board. So you can imagine the search time is going to be much longer then than it is now. Also, the labor force participation rate can change. That could change the unemployment rate just by, thinking of, we could have the number of people unemployed fixed, but if the labor force changes, that's going to change our unemployment figure, right? Because we're looking at the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. But the labor force could change and we could still have the same number of people unemployed. So if, for example, a lot of people become retired all at once, then our labor force is going to fall. And for a given unemployment rate, that would make the unemployment rate higher, even though the number of people who are unemployed didn't change at all. And movements between the different types of unemployment. So if we look here, we have unemployed to the left, and then we have not in the labor force to the right, and then employed on the bottom. So retirees would obviously be moving from the employed state to the not in the labor force state. If we have people who are unemployed for a long period and then just give up, then we have discouraged workers, and they would move into the not in the labor force state. For example, if we had students who just graduated, or discouraged workers, or someone who just worked at home and weren't part of the labor force, if they decide to look for work, then they go from the not in the labor force state to the unemployed state. And of course, if you're laid off, or if you quit, or you're fired from a job, you go from the employed state to the unemployed state. If you're unemployed and you get hired, then you're obviously moving from the unemployed state to the employed state. With the rate, one of the issues is that it essentially treats full-time and part-time workers the same. So in that case, it may be sort of understating the importance of unemployment. Or you could think of the unemployment rate could be at a decent number, respectable number that's very low. But if a lot of people are working in part-time jobs rather than full-time, then they're underemployed. And so it's not capturing the underemployed nature of the workforce. Also, it excludes discouraged workers. So those who want work, but they're not seeking it, believing there's no opportunities. So it doesn't include those. Of course, the statistics that are collected from the government enables you to actually calculate what this unemployment rate would be. So it's not like the data isn't there, but we typically just, the media or the financial institutions or economists will report this, the main headline unemployment rate. And so it can be understated because it's not including these groups. But of course, if you're interested in seeing what that number is, it's not like you can't obtain it. There is some data available that would allow you to calculate that. Now, it could be overstated. So because of false information from EI recipients, maybe they're not really unemployed, or people could say that they're unemployed, get benefits, but really they're working in the underground economy. So, it's not a perfect measure, but a lot of the times what matters is changes over time. So maybe the level isn't perfect, but, changes over time would be fine, because we would just be looking at how, maybe the overall level isn't perfectly correct, but if we see that the unemployment rate increased by 2 percentage points, well, that's, pretty significant. We know that a large number of people have become unemployed. Swing people. So we have Sanjit, a pulp mill worker. This person has been laid off because the mill's inventories are at an all-time high. So we're thinking here, when a company's inventories start to increase, that's usually because they're not able to sell them. So, and that could be because, let's just think that maybe there's some kind of a recession. So in this case, what type of unemployment would this be? Yeah, that's correct. So it would call. Now we have Al job. Thank you. And on the east, sold his boat after years of hard work with little return. And he's not been employed now for almost a year. So this person has a skill, but that skill isn't garnering him much of an income anymore. So, yeah, so you guessed it, the answer would be structural. When people lose their jobs, they lose their income, and so there's a financial cost to them. There's also lots of social cost. There's a lot of negative social costs that can occur because of people losing their job, things like depression, that sort of thing. We are going to focus on, well, this is an economics course, so those characteristics would be outside of this outside of this discipline. But one of the ways economists like to measure the cost of unemployment is basically the foregone income or loss in GDP that would be associated with people not working. So when we have people who are unemployed, we're not producing at our potential. Okay, so we have a lot of trade that could be occurring that's so lost forever. So for example, with this COVID-19 situation, there are a lot of mutually beneficial trades that are not occurring. There's people who want a haircut, for example, who can't get it. That's value. There's things that are not being produced, which are, create value. And there's a lot of mutually beneficial trades that are not occurring, and that is lost forever. There might be some, in the recovery, some pent up demand, and so maybe more will be produced. But when you have a lot of people unemployed, and bottom line is our income as a society is based on the goods and services that we produce. That's the total value of production, which is equal to people's incomes. And so when that falls because people aren't working, it's a negative thing. And so that's what we're interested in measuring, is the difference between our potential GDP and what the actual GDP is. So that's called the GDP gap. So the GDP gap is simply our potential GDP. So this is if everyone's working, all of our resources are being utilized in the economy, minus what our actual GDP is. And there's this thing called Oken. It's a rough how much the potential will be lower than the actual. So the law states that for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, an economy's GDP is 2.5% below its potential. And so the GDP gap would be of 2.5 cyclical unemployment we have. So if it's 2%, we would just have 2 here. So we'd have 2.5 times 2, and then we would multiply that by the GDP. So let's do a question to the natural rate of unemployment is 8%, and the actual rate of unemployment, real GDP, is 800 billion. So how would I calculate potential GDP? So first of all, what is the cyclical unemployment rate here? G times the cyclical unemployment rate, which is 2, and then multiplying it by 800 billion. So if we do that, we get that the GDP gap is $40 billion. So then how do we get potential P? So right now our actual GDP is, and we know that we're 40 billion less than, and what would be potential GDP? 840, that's correct. So it would be 840. So in this, the unemployment, the cost of unemployment, if we want a dollar figure for it, it would be $40 billion in lost production, which is equal to incomes. Okay, so rise in the general level of prices. We use a price index to measure inflation. There are two widely used, and this is constructed by Statistics Canada, and it's based on a set basket of goods that average family would consume. Okay, and then the GDP deflator is basically it's the difference between nominal and real GDP. We'll look at that at a moment and see where that comes from. So what's important first be into calculating inflation, and before we look at a actual price index, let's just look at what a simple index is. Because once we know what a simple index is, it's fairly straightforward to see what a price index is. So a simple index is obtained, basic index, we can create a new series of numbers that are easier to read. Suppose we have data here, and this is sales for a particular company. And these could be in millions of dollars. So sales in 2001 were 540, and then 2002, 680, and 2003 are 980. Now, suppose in 2002, some important event happened at the company. Maybe there is a new CEO. Okay, so let's pick that as our base year, okay, and we want everything relative to. So in order to create a simple index then, we're going to take each of these numbers and divide it by the base year number. Okay, so if we do that, we'll get 0.79 for 2001. This is again obtained by taking 540 divided by 680. Okay, so that's where we get the 0.79. The base year, obviously the number is going to be equal to 1, right? We're just going to be taking 680 divided by 680. That's the year we want everything relative to. And then the next year, 2003, we take 980 divided by 680, and we get 1.44. So, but for index numbers, we just want to multiply these by 100. So now we have this nice clean series of, so remember, millions of dollars, there could be lots of, it's just not as nice and easy to read. When we look at this index here, this series of index numbers, based on this, we can get a very clear picture of how sales have changed. We can immediately look at this and know that after the new CEO was hired, sales went up by 44%. We can't really get as much information by looking at this. We know 980 is larger than 680, but it's not very clear what the percentage difference is here. So with an index, each one of these we would call an index number, and this is the series of the index number. So again, we've converted this into a simple index. So clearly we can see more information here on changes over time. It's just a nice, easier way to present numbers, for example. Now, just to clarify, or to make sure you recognize this, that if I were to look at the percentage change between these numbers and look at the percentage change between these numbers, they're going to be the same. Okay, so between 2001 and 2002, sales increased by 26.6%, and between 2002 and 2003, sales went up by 44%. And since this here is 100, we can clearly see the 44%. Now, the percentage increase from here to here isn't, you'd have to take new minus old over old and then multiply it by 100. It's not just the difference between these two numbers, but it's kind of close, and we can see that it's roughly 20 to 30% increase just by looking at this. By looking at this, it's not so clear. So anyways, that's how you do a simple index. Now, a price index is pretty much the same thing. It's just that here we're using sales numbers. When we're looking at a price index, we're going to be looking at the cost of a basket of goods in a particular year. So if we had 3 years, we would have the cost of the basket of goods for each of those years. And there's some nuances in terms of how we calculate the cost of the baskets of goods. But once we have the properly calculated cost of the baskets of goods in each year, we calculate the price index the same way. We're just going to be taking the cost of the baskets and dividing it by whatever we decide to be the base year. The year divided by the cost of the basket another year. So this don't get let this is just representing a sum. So you can think of this term here as the cost of a basket of goods, because we're just going to be multiplying the prices of the goods times the quantities. Now, in any particular year, the price index is going to be the cost of the basket of goods in the current year. So we're going to use the prices in the current year and then multiply it by the base year quantities. So with a price index, we're obviously the cost of a basket of goods is going to change for two reasons over time. Prices will change, and then the quantities of what people buy will change. When we're looking at a price index, we want to hold constant the quantities so that just the prices are changing, because that's what we're interested in. We're interested in how prices change over time. So a price index in a particular period is just going to be the cost of the basket of goods using prices in the current year, and then multiplied by the quantity in the base year. By that, the base year price and quantity. So again, the idea is to hold goods and services, and then we'll create an index out of that like we did before. And so the differences between the index figures are just going to represent differences in the cost of the basket of goods that reflect only price changes, not changes in the quantity. So let's go through an example that we can do to reinforce this idea. So let's think of a student price index. So in this first table here, we have expenditure behavior in 2009. So basically we have some products here that students buy: photocopies, pizza, and coffee. We have their prices, we have their quantities, and we have expense items each month. Call them just by multiplying these together. So if we multiply these together, we get the expenditure for each item, and then we take the sum, and we see that the cost of this student basket of goods in 2009 is $200. Okay? Now, in 2019, we have the new prices. So usually we look at the cost of the baskets of goods on a years later. The idea is the same. So now, 10 years later, these are the new prices. Now, we're holding constant the quantities here. So the quantities may have changed in 2019, but we're going to keep these the same as in 2009. Otherwise, the cost of the basket of good here would reflect price and quantity changes, and we don't want that. We just want to know the cost of the basket of good, how it changes because of prices. So these two quantities, the quantities for the goods are held constant here. And so when we recalculate the cost of the basket of goods using the new prices, we get that the cost of the basket of goods is $230. So once we have this, it's easy to create the price index. We just do like we did before. We pick the base year. So let's pick 2009 as the base year. So then we're just going to take this divided by itself is equal to 1, and then this divided by that. We're just going to take each year's cost and divide it by the base year. So when we do that, obviously the base year is going to be 100, and then the next year, the 2019, we're going to cost of the basket of goods divided by 200, which is the amount in the base year, and multiply by 100, and we get 115. Okay, and if we go back, I'll just go back to the previous. We're going to divide it by the same thing, so that's why we get 1. But in the second year, 2019, we're going to use the prices in 2019, but multiply that by the quantities in the base year. And then we're going to divide that by the cost of the basket of goods in the base year. And that's where we get the 1.15 from. Okay, so what a price index would look like for this student price index, it would be 100 and 115, and that's for those 2 years. And so we can clearly see by looking at this that prices increased 15% between these 2 years. Now, suppose we had data for 2029, and let's suppose that the cost of goods in that year was 285. Again, we would have calculated this using these quantities, so we would have held these quantities constant. If that's the case, what would be the index value for 2029? Anyone? Divide price index. And this tells you how prices have changed over time. So inflation is actually just the percentage change in these values. And we can clearly see that inflation between 2009 and 2019 was 15%. And you can go on Statistics Canada and it shows you actually the. So again, to measure inflation, we get the price index. So if we had the consumer price index, which is Statistics Canada's constructed price index, which is based on the average level of prices of a set basket of goods for typical Canadian families, we would have a series of numbers that looks like what we just saw, 98, 100, 125. It'll be a series of numbers like that. And to calculate inflation, we just calculate the percentage change in the index values. So, for example, here we have a price. Okay, so this is number 2014 up to just 16. And so here we have the different values of the price index. The base year here is 2002. So in 2002, this thing is equal to 100. So we're already in 2014. So, if we were to go back and update the data all the way back to 2002, we would see that, it would be down here somewhere where the CPI would equal to 100. But this isn't a graph of inflation. This is a graph of the consumer price index. Inflation is the percentage change in these. So inflation between this point and this point would be obtained by doing the percentage change. So we would take this figure minus this figure. So we would look at the difference and then divide it by the original figure. And so that would be how much prices increased in terms of a percent, which is what inflation is. So, and we could do that in between all of these different points. And if we did that and then plotted the data, we would get a chart of inflation. So we can see here that we have the consumer price index increase fairly quickly like this. The inflation rate's going to be quite high. But if we look at these 2 points, we see that it's actually going to be negative because this value is less than this value. So when we calculate inflation here, it's going to be negative, and that would be this point here. Okay? So this is how inflation over these months and years of the consumer. So the consumer price index is not inflation, it's what we use to calculate inflation. And again, to calculate inflation, we do our percentage change formula, which is just the new or current minus the previous or old. So it's the difference divided by the original number where we were before. And then we multiply that by 100. If you just think of a simple example like the price of a can of Coke. No, let's do gasoline. So the price of gasoline was $1.20 today. It's $1.30 tomorrow. In terms of a percent, how much did the price of gas increase? Well, what we want to do is take the difference. So we take 130 minus 120. So we take that difference and then we divide it by the original number 120. So we're at, I should say $1.20. So we're at $1.20. The next day the price goes up to $1.30. Okay, so the price went up 10 cents per liter. That 10% as a proportion of what it was before, the $1.20, is what we're interested in. And so we would take 0.10 and then divide it by 1.20, multiply that by 100, and we would get the percentage change in the price of gasoline. So another measure we can use to represent price changes is by using the GDP deflator. Now this is much different. The consumer price index is explicit. The Statistics Canada determines what products people buy, the average family buys. So the typical family, what their basket of goods is. The GDP deflator is different. It's basically a measure of the price level of all the goods and services included in GDP. And so it's simply calculated by taking, for any particular year, the nominal GDP and dividing it by the real GDP, and then multiplying that by 100. So this is a much more comprehensive measure because it's including things like tractors and goods used in manufacturing. So it's not just a basket of goods that the consumer would consume. It's including everything that's produced in the economy. So let's look at an example. So let's just suppose we have a simple economy with two goods, potatoes and milk. So in 2014, if we were to calculate the nominal GDP, it would be 4,200. In 2015, if we calculate the nominal GDP, it would be 5,630. So we're just taking the prices, multiplying them by the quantities, and then taking a sum. And I'll go over this if you watch the lecture for chapter 3. We'll talk about it will give you some more background on what I'm doing here, but it's pretty straightforward. We're just multiplying the prices and quantities, and that gives us our nominal GDP. Okay? Now, if the base year is 2014, then we are saying that this is the base year. This is where we stand. Okay? Because when we look at GDP over time, we're interested in how economic activity changes. So how much production changes. We don't want that to be confused or confounded with price changes as well. So when we calculate real GDP, what we do is we determine a base year. So here we'll say that 2014 is the base year. And so we're going to use 2014 prices and then use the quantities in 2014. So then obviously these two numbers are going to be the same. But in 2015, to calculate real GDP, we are going to use the prices in 2014, but we're going to use the quantities in 2015. And so when we multiply these prices and these quantities together, we get that real GDP is 4,500. So now the difference between these two numbers here is only because of difference in production and quantity, and which is differences in economic activity. Okay, so that's real and nominal GDP. So if we had these figures, then if we were to take in 2015 the nominal GDP and divide it by the real GDP, well, this number is larger than this number only because of the differences in prices. So when we divide them and multiply it by 100, it gives us 107.14. So we can see here that how much prices have increased, what the difference in prices here. So it's 7.414%. So if we had a number of different years where we had data on nominal and real GDP, we could do this procedure and we would get a series of numbers that look like the consumer price index numbers or the price index numbers, but they're not the same thing. These are based on all of the goods and services that are produced in the economy. But you can use them in the same way. So when we use the CPI, as I said, it's explicit. It's using a remains constant. This is not going to include anything like capital or government services. It's only including what the average family typically consumes, right? And it would obviously also include imported goods. If Many families buy stuff from the dollar store, which is all imported. So that would be part of the typical family's uh, basket of goods, right? But with the GDP deflator, it's more implicit. It's just looking at the ratio of nominal GDP, and the bundle of goods can change each year, so that's not really being held constant, and it can include anything that's produced in the economy. So it can include a plant, the manufacturing of tractors, for example. That's not going to be in the CPI, but it'll be in the GDP deflator. Of course, include imported goods because GDP is just a measure of production of goods and services within the country's borders. Okay, so it would not include imported goods. Okay, so let's do a practice question here. So here we have nominal GDP and the GDP deflator. Now we've put in here population and real GDP per capita. This is something that we looked at briefly in chapter 3. Real GDP per capita is simple. You just take the real GDP and divide it by the population. So now if if the nominal GDP is 443 and real GDP is 374, what is the GDP deflator? Anyone? Yeah. So we just take those two, divide it, multiply it by 100. We get 118.4 per capita. How would we get that? 4 and divide it by the population. We have to be careful here because millions, this is measured in millions, right? This is in billions, this is in millions. So we just want to move the decimal place. So if we put this in billions, we would just move this decimal place over 3 and then divide those two, and we would get real GDP per capita. We'll go back to that in a sec, because the way this animation is done is that we look at this number next. So if the GDP deflator is 121.9 and the real GDP is 389, how do we get this number? Okay, so yeah, it's 474. So let's write this out for you. It's nominal over real, right? It's equal to the GDP deflator. I'll just put GD for the GDP. This is 121.9. The real GDP is 380. And so nominal, multiply those. Okay, similarly, if we had nominal and the GDP to 14,329 in 2013, 14,734 in 2014, and 14,888.9 in 2015. Again, we're just taking the real GDP and dividing it by the population. So let's talk about the difference between nominal versus real income. Nominal figure is when you use the current year prices, so everything's in the current year is measured. There's no adjustment made for price changes. So nominal income would just be the dollar value that you got on all of your paychecks at the end of the year. Real income is when we make adjustments for prices. So we're here now thinking about the purchasing power. We're looking at nominal income divided by the price level. So there's a general formula that we can use to figure out what the real value of something is in a particular year. So think of two different years, year A and year B. So the real value of something in year B would be equal to the nominal value in year A divided by the price index year A multiplied by the price index in year B. Okay, if year B is the base year, then this would just be 100. So let's do it very clear looking at the formula. So suppose we had some data on nominal income. So this is the average income in some economy. There's different years that we have it for. Okay. And then we are given a price index year. So the base year is 2011. Okay. And we can see here that the prices are all lower because these index values are lower than 11. So suppose we want to know, um, so suppose we want two income. So this income here in $11. I know, okay, this person made, or the average income for the economy in this year was 50,796. But I want to know if that's, what that would be in 2011. Person's income, I would want to know, okay, this person made 50,796 in 2014. How much would that be equivalent to in 2011? So to do that, we use our formula. So here, year A is the 50,796, okay? And the B is the 2011. So what we do is to get the real value of this, figure, we take the nominal value in year A, so the 50,796, and then we divide it by the price index in that year, okay? And then we multiply it by the price index in year B. Year B is just 100. So basically just putting this into 2011 dollars, since this price index is based on 2011, you basically can just take this and divide it by 0.883 and you'll get it. So what we do then is we take 50,796 divided by 88.3, and then we multiply it by 100, and we end up getting 57,526. So this person clearly then is making more money in terms of its purchasing power in 2011, if this was a person. Or we could think of the overall economy. So the overall economy here, their income in 2011 is much better than 2004. Now we could just compare these two figures, but remember, the difference in these two figures would not be directly comparable because the prices are different. The prices are different in 2004, right? So $50,000 could buy more or less than this in 2011 because the prices are different in each of these years, right? So what we're doing is holding constant purchasing power or the prices in a particular year and then comparing the two numbers. So this amount of money in 2011 dollars is $57,526. So that's less than $63,000. So the income is actually better here. Now suppose, though, we want 2004 year A income. So again, this number. Let's say we want to compare it to 2008. So let's say we're interested in comparing this and this. So is this more money than this in terms of purchasing power? Well, in this case, what we have to do is take this number, divide it by the price index. So that's 4. But now instead of multiplying by 100, we're going to multiply it by the price index in year B. In this case, year B is 2008, and the price index in 2008 is 95.1. And so we multiply that by 95.1, and we get 54,707. Yeah. So I guess your question, Lena, is it always going to be 100? The formula. Yeah. So maybe it's good just to do a couple questions, just to practice, and you'll see exactly. Okay. So just follow this formula, what I'm doing here, and yeah, always. So so if you look at this, you're taking this, dividing by that, and then multiplying this by 100. You to taking this and then dividing it by 0.883, and then because if you put it with this, you'll get 0.883. So just follow this where we actually put the index value that's not divided by 100, and then keeping, and then multiplying it by the 100 here. So just keep consistent in your formula. But you'll know if you did something wrong, because If I took this and just divided it by 88.3, my number is not going to make any sense. We know that, prices changed here, not a huge amount. So when I look at this answer here, this number should be, if this number was 5,000, I know I did something wrong, right? So it'll be clear when you're doing the questions. Okay, so if we recall our student price index that we had before, remember we had 101.15. Suppose that the nominal student income in each of these 2 years was 23,000 and 24 respectively. So let's look at what real student income would be. So 2003 is the base year, so that's going to be the same thing. Now 2000, oh sorry, these numbers were from a previous version. So the newer version I had 2009 and 2019. So these should be 2009 and 2019 to be consistent with the example before. So anyways, in 2013 or 2019, income's 24,000. So is this more income? Like, is this going to give the person more purchasing power? Yes, their nominal income increased, but that doesn't mean they're better off, because prices could have changed such that this amount of money can buy less. So to get what real student income is in 2013, we take the 24,000, divide it by 1.15, or alternatively, we could divide by 115 and then multiply the whole thing by 100, and you'll get the same answer. And so we see that real income is actually 20,868. So 869. So we have that their nominal income increased by 1,000, but they're actually worse off. Their real income has fallen. And it's easy to see why. The percentage increase in income here is very small. It's 1,000 divided by 23,000 times 100. But we know prices went up by 15%. So prices increased much more than income. So of course your real income has fallen. Your purchasing power has fallen. Okay? There's another important formula that you should know. Basically, it's just this formula here over the price index in a particular year. So when we're doing this, we're converting it to whatever year the price index base year is. So we can rewrite this. If you know calculus, you could you would ln both sides, and then I think you just totally differentiate it, and anyways, you could see that you can convert this into this formula here. So the real value of something, the percentage change in the real value of something, is just equal to the percentage change in the nominal minus the percentage change in price. So for example, if we're talking about GDP, the percentage change in real GDP would be equal to the percentage change in the nominal GDP minus the percentage change in price, which is inflation. Also, if we're thinking of interest rates, the real interest rate of something would be equal to the nominal rate minus investment, and you get 10% return over the year. That's your nominal rate of return. But if inflation was 5%, then you really only made 5%, which would be the 10 minus the 5. So let's do an active learning question. So consider borrowing a sum of money for 1 year at a nominal interest rate of 11%. And during that same year, the inflation rate was 4%. What real rate of interest did you pay? Yeah. So the real rate of interest minus the inflation rate. Now suppose we have P 2 billion to 45 billion. And during that same period, the inflation rate was 5%. So first, how do we calculate the percentage change in nominal GDP? Does someone want to write it in the chat function? So we would take 45 minus something. How much then did real GDP? So it's 2.14%. So there's another interesting tool or formula here that you can use that you should always growing with a compound interest rate. So, for example, if you have some money invested in the bank, you can also think of anything with growth. So you can think of the real GDP. So any series of numbers that's growing at a compound rate, you can easily estimate how long it would take to double. And all you do is take the number 70 and divide it by that growth rate. So, for example, if you have money invested in the bank, doesn't matter how much, if you have some money invested in the bank and it's getting a 10% interest rate, then it will double in 70 divided by 10 equals 7 years. If the economy is growing at 10% per year, so let's say real GDP is growing at 10% per year, well, then the real GDP will double in 10 years. Okay, so this is just a handy tool. So, one thing that's interesting, if you think about the difference in growth rates between countries, if a country is growing at 10% per year, it's going to double in 7 years. But if it's growing at 5%, it's going to double in much less. So even small changes in the growth rate could result in, a much quicker doubling in the overall amount. Now, you don't have to, but some of you who are mind, if you want, where this comes from, put that in. So these are just people who are interested, but you can see that the rule is basically 0.693. That comes from the ln of 2, and then that's divided by the rate. In this, the way this is written here, the rate is not multiplied by 100. When you multiply it by 100, then you get, close to 70, and then you actually put the rate with, in after it's been multiplied by 100. So the cost of inflation. So let's first talk about the cost of inflation that's predictable. So we know that the prices change. Companies need to put time and effort. It could cost money, keeping up with the changes in prices. So this was particularly important, many years ago, maybe in the 80s, early 90s. For example, there used to be a company that, I forget the name now, but they had a popular catalog, and you would go to this place and look at the catalog and place an order for what you wanted to buy. So if prices change, they got to reprint all of these catalogs across the country, so that's quite expensive. Today, with the internet, it's a little less costly. It's not as difficult to change prices. However, there's still costs. You still have to pay someone to update your website, etc. So even though inflation is predictable, there's some small costs associated with having to always update your cost. Another term called shoe leather costs refers to the time and effort people must spend managing of inflation. So, even though with online banking now your actual shoes aren't going to be wearing out, you still need to, put effort and time into transferring your assets, and making sure you're not going to lose out because of prices increasing. Now, we've been lucky since the early 90s. The government has actively managed inflation and made sure that it stays very low, between 1% and 3%. But before the 90s, so when my parents grew up, prices changed at a much faster pace. For example, you could have yearly inflation of 10%, 12%. More if you look at mortgage rates in the 70s and 80s, there were some points where the mortgage interest rate was almost as much as what the interest rate is now on a credit card. But since the early 90s, they've done a very good job at keeping inflation very predictable, stable, and low, between 1% and 3%. But in the past, these were much more serious concerns than they are now. And even in other countries at this point, and even in recent years, they've had hyperinflation, like in Zimbabwe. So we've been lucky that our government manages our money supply properly, but some countries and in the past, and even within Canada, the inflation rate was much higher and more unstable than it is now. Um, there's also issues with tax distortions. The bottom line is you get taxed on your nominal income. So if you purchase some kind of an investment and you get a 10% interest rate, then you're taxed on what that 10% interest rate gives you. So if it's $1,000, you made $100 in the year in interest, you're going to get taxed on that $100. But what if inflation was also 10%? Well, then you actually didn't make anything, but you're still going to have to pay tax on the $100. So that is an issue even if inflation is predictable. Unpredictable inflation, well, you have redistribution costs. So, for example, if you have unexpected inflation, then they actually will lose out because their income is fixed. And so it's not going to increase with that inflation. And so their purchasing power is going to fall. Um, when you think about lenders and borrowers, when they get into an agreement, so for example, a lender will decide to lend somebody money at a certain interest rate, say 10%, and it's like a contract, it's fixed. You can't renegotiate that after the initial lending is done. Um, so let's suppose we have that situation where a lender has made a loan and the interest rate is 10%. Now, if inflation unexpectedly goes up, let's just say to 20%, well, that lender is going to lose out now because the borrower just has to pay back the 10% and the money that they borrowed. Now, but with inflation going up that much, the lender now is getting money back that's not worth as much. If they could do things over again, they would have, if the inflation was predictable, they would have negotiated a much higher interest rate so that they can cover themselves from that increased inflation. So you can see that if the inflation is unexpected, you get some redistribution between borrowers and lenders. Borrowers will be made better off than the lenders. Also, in terms of output costs, many businesses have a profit margin of less than 10%. So if the company can't be sure whether prices are going to go up by 5 or 10% over the next year, that makes planning really tough. Bottom line, with inflation, and especially if it's unpredictable, that creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is not a good friend of business. And so that could reduce economic activity. Now, we'll just finish up with two different causes of inflation. So the cause that we're more familiar with is demand. You have businesses providing goods and services. Now, in the short run, they're limited in terms of can produce because they have a fixed size of plant. A hairdresser only has a small space. So if demand were to suddenly increase, let's use the example of the government printing money and dumping it out from helicopters and just giving it away to everyone. It sounds like everyone would be rich, but all that's going to happen is that the demand, think of the thousands of different markets, the demand is all going to increase in all of those markets. But if the firms can't keep up with that demand, then all you're going to end up with is shortages. And that's going to just drive up the price. And so that would be an example of demand pull inflation, because unless the supply side can keep up, there'll just be shortages and the prices will be bid up. So if you overstimulate, and this is an example, sometimes if the government's not good or prudent, they may do something like stimulate the economy through tax cuts when the economy is already at its peak. What you get is just a lot of more aggregate demand. So you get a lot of demand for stuff. But if the economy is already running at capacity, you're just going to end up causing inflation. So that's demand pull inflation. So you basically have the demand in the economy outstripping the economy's ability to supply that demand. Cost push inflation is different. This is like for some reason there's a huge increase in the cost of production. So the example was of this was back in the day when we had the in the 70s the OPEC. They what they did is they cut production and cause the prices of oil to skyrocket. And so, gasoline's made so it's a huge input cost to a lot of different goods. Even if it's not used directly in producing something, goods need to be transported. So, uh, the price of oil is going to be very, a huge increase in the price of oil is going to cause the price of gasoline to go up and cause cost to increase across the board for many companies. And so in that case, you get that prices are going to increase as a result, but it's not because of demand, it's because of the increase in the costs. Other things that could cause this would be unions negotiating huge wage increases, would be, a huge increase in the price of inputs. Okay, so that ends our lecture for today. These are the key concepts that we looked at. Have a great weekend.